everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and I'm incredibly grateful to say that my guest today is retired firefighter Paul Falla. He served with Engine 83 out of the Bronx on 9/11 at Ground Zero. So, Paul, thank you very kindly for being with us today to share your story of grit.
Sure. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So please take the listeners back to 9/11. This is back, obviously, this was a number of years ago. We're going back to 2001, but still everything is very real today. So on that morning, you had just had a 24-hour shift of serving as a
Mhm.
firefighter, and now you're back at the firehouse. And could you please tell our listeners just what ensued?
Yeah, as you remember, we talked before, and I was supposed to be getting off that morning, and I was in a waiting relief for someone coming in shortly after the change of tours. And, we got a run came in. So I had to jump on the rig with the guys that were supposed to be working that day. And we went down, and long day, as you imagine. You want me to go through the whole thing we talked about before?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So the whole idea of hearing that a plane had come in and hit one of the
Yeah.
World Trade Towers.
I mean, obviously at the time, as we're heading down into Manhattan from the South Bronx, it was a lot of things going, a lot of chatter through the radio, a lot of things not really understanding. I don't think anyone really knew what was going on at that moment. And as I told you previously, we were heading straight down to Lower Manhattan, and we were really supposed to be going to a staging area in Harlem. So between a covering captain, Captain Morgan, and our chauffeur, Mike Killarney, at some point along the way, sitting in traffic on the FDR Drive, trying to make our way down to Lower Manhattan, we figured out that, or someone in the front of the cab figured out that we really should have been going to a staging area. Turned around on 23rd Street, if you remember, we talked about that, and started heading back north. When we got up to quarters of, I think it was 35 and 14 truck, up on 3rd Avenue, and I think they're 116th Street, 115th Street, I forget the exact address. There was like 5 or 6 other companies waiting. Chief basically turned us all around and sent us right down the West Side Highway at that point, towards the Trade Center. And that was the start of the very long day.
Absolutely. So, so in theory, when you think about the time that it took for you to realize, wait a minute, we should be going to a staging area, which just for our listeners, that staging area would be where other first responders would go to actually prepare for what's our strategy to go to where this
Yes,
plane came in, right?
this was different because a lot of big multiple alarms will have a staging area, from a second or a third above. The staging area is usually a block or 2 or 3 blocks away from where the job is going on, which was, this one was, gosh, I mean, no, all the way in Harlem and north, it's many, 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 many blocks away from, miles away from South Lower Manhattan. So it was unusual to go up there, but that's what that particular staging area was. And I'm sure there was others around the different boroughs, to accumulate men for Brooklyn or Staten Island or Queens or whatever. So
Right. So now all of a sudden, you left the staging area and you're heading down to what we now call Ground Zero. At this point, it was just the first plane that had hit, correct?
yeah, correct. Yeah, I
Okay.
think the second one hit when we were somewhere heading down West Side Highway, if I remember correctly. Or maybe it was while we're weaving through the streets in the north side. I'm not sure. I don't remember, so many years ago. But I remember getting feedback from a friend of mine who was calling me on my cell at the time, and before my cell phone died, and he was feeding us information from the news and things of that nature.
So at that point, then I'm assuming, was it more a matter of confusion or was it more disbelief, or do you recall even just what the general feeling was when you're with your company in the fire truck at that point?
Listen to the department radio and hearing the feedback from over the radio, not the local transmissions from the radios that we wear on our body, but like the department radio.
I'm sorry, I thought I was going to sneeze.
God bless you.
Okay, yeah. All of a sudden just sneeze now when it's totally inappropriate. So sorry about that.
You're fine.
But so you're hearing over the radio these different transmissions
Yeah.
and on your cell phone, which I
Well, not my
imagine.
cell phone. No, there's a radio in the back of the rig, and we're listening.
Okay.
what goes on. Like if you're going to a job or something and, you're responding and you're not sure it's a fire yet, because maybe you might be first, second, third due, whatever. A lot of times you'll hear through the radio from the dispatcher, getting multiple calls, fire reports of fire at the window, whatever it may be. So the radio is actually like a tool for listening to what's happening before you get to a scene. It's actually very useful. And
Okay.
yeah, like we're hearing all kinds of things. I remember an odd transmission. A civilian gets on a radio, I guess from one of the rigs parked, and is screaming over the radio to the dispatchers in Manhattan. I remember that distinctly. That I thought that was an unusual transmission. There was a lot of chaos, obviously. So
Oh, absolutely. So by the time you got there, I'm assuming the first tower had already fallen.
yes,
And so I'm envisioning lots of debris, smoke. I mean, could you even, I mean, hardly even breathe? I mean, or even how far ahead of you could you even see?
we didn't know it was a full collapse at the time. We thought it was a partial collapse. When we rolled down West Side Highway, it was clear. It was a warm, sunny day, so it was still clear, and there was obviously things in the distance we could see as we approached. Dust clouds had not hit us at the time. I mean, they might have went south at the time. I'm not sure, but it wasn't until we got off the rig. We got as close as we could, obviously, and then got out, got our roll-ups, got gear, extra Scott tanks, and then started heading on West Side Highway towards the scene. And at a certain point, as we were walking in with other members that were also in the entourage going down to the area, that's when the North Tower fell. And then at that point, everything started coming towards us like a big cloud thing.
So I remember from when I had interviewed you for my book that you were given directions amongst this chaos to drop your equipment and run.
Yeah, the cap.
And was that at that point?
Yeah. So there's a photo of an overpass bridge that's on West Side Highway. We had just actually gone under that. There's a photo of someone took a snapshot of a fireman. I don't know who it was. Man, it could have been one of the guys I was with. I don't even remember. There's no name on the thing. It's just a weird upshot of the towers with the burning, and then you see the bridge. We had actually walked under that bridge and probably maybe 100 yards in front of it when the North Tower came down, and the captain's like, just drop everything and run.
So if you had to guess, how heavy was the like just what you were wearing even to run? Like over 100 pounds?
You know, I don't remember the exact weight. I always thought it was more than it was. It was heavy. Bunker coat, bunker pants, boots, helmet, some other layers. And then you've got your Scott pack, and we're carrying roll-ups, 2.5-inch roll-ups, 50-foot lengths. We were carrying extra bottles and then tools.
And roll-ups are hoses, correct?
Hoses that are rolled like flat and then kind of kept together with rubber, like big, thick rubber. We use those in stairwells, on concrete structures and things that have, interior attached through standpipes.
And what was it an abbreviation or an acronym that you would use earlier for the oxygen tank you would normally have that now you had to take off?
Scott pack, yeah, SCBA, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a tank connected to a shoulder straps thing, and you've got a mask that you put on when you go into conditions. Yeah, we didn't really use that because they only have a working time of like 6 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because you're breathing.
Okay.
They'll call them like 30-minute tanks or 45-minute tanks, but they're actually only give you a few minutes of hard breathing working time before they start to go dead.
So now you don't have the use of that, and you're
also outside though. We're not inside, so it's not really something you would put on or don.
yeah. So how long were you there before the second tower collapsed?
Oh, I wouldn't say long at all. Said we were already approaching and walking towards the buildings when that North Tower came down. Big loud rumble kind of thing, pancaking.
I was going to ask you what it sounded like.
I don't know how to describe the sound. My friend Dave did, but again, it was so long ago, and it was loud, and it was not something you'd ever heard before, right? So a lot of boom, 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 a lot of noise that echoed through the neighborhoods, and a lot of smoke and debris just in the air at that. But until that came down, walking towards it was fine. It wasn't until that north tower that came down when it really kind of became shitty. So
So I know when I had interviewed you for the book, you had talked about how I believe it was your captain, but maybe it was somebody else who would be calling for other firefighters by name, and that was kind of an unusual thing. That when you would hear those are they called transmissions or emissions or what do you call it?
transmissions
That transmissions that
to
usually it wouldn't be for people by name.
no.
Do you recall like what was the situation that prompted that, or what was it? How did it happen to be that it was someone's name was used?
So that was more later on in the day when we were literally searching through debris, and it was a captain of Rescue 3 who was down there, Ralph Tiso. I think I'm saying his name correctly. Hopefully, he was making transmissions because there was no everything got wiped out, so there was no command center at the time.
Mhm.
So it was like senior officers, not my captain. I mean senior officers that been on the job for decades that were kind of taking a hold of and talking to each other, by their first name. Where are you at, Charlie, or where are you out, Ralph?
Oh,
It wasn't like normal transmissions, Rescue 3 to so and so or whatever. So it was definitely different. And you'd listen, and I mean, it was just really do what you could do at the time, at that immediate moment.
absolutely. I remember a former colleague of mine telling me that his ex-wife worked in one of the World Trade Towers, and they were still on good terms. And she had talked about how, as she looked around the street as she was running, that she could see a lot of pairs of women's high-heeled shoes. And so she took hers off as well because it was
Yeah,
just easier to run
sure.
without wearing heels. So there were just heels everywhere.
Yeah.
And, I also heard stories about how there were train stations where people's cars just stayed because obviously the people who passed away couldn't get on the subway or the train or whatever it was to then get back there to get to their cars. So they
Yeah,
were just, people just had passed away. So it was a very ominous thing.
for sure.
So yeah, yeah. And I know a lot of people tend to concentrate on what people would see, but I'm wondering about other things as well. Like, I mean, how did it feel? Was it like a thick, like did the air feel heavy, or how do you recall, or what did it smell like, or that kind like was it smoke or oil or jet fuel
No,
or
I mean, well, at first, when we got hit by the cloud of debris as we were walking towards them, the Trade Center, and when the captain said drop and run, we obviously got engulfed by what came across, kind of gathered ourselves, and we started heading back. I mean, it was just lots of things in the air, particles. Our eyes were covered in, I would say dust. And I mean, I think throughout the day, Red Cross showed up at some point and kept washing everyone's eyes out because it was constant.
yeah.
Um, Again, it's hard to describe what we were choking on because you didn't really know. It wasn't just
Yeah.
smoke. It was just crushed debris, clouds of the white and gray, whatever it was crushed concrete and everything else in between, and obviously some fire involved, obviously initially.
Right. I think it's so surreal how I would hear news reports about hospitals in the area who braced themselves for this onslaught of people who just never came because people either got out of the towers or they didn't. So they're just they envisioned all these people who were injured to be
Correct.
coming, but it wasn't quite the volume because unfortunately it was people either didn't make it or they could. It was kind of either or.
Yeah.
Um, very surreal,
Yeah,
you
for sure.
know.
Remember the whole thing with all the hospitals were bracing themselves, and it wasn't what they were expecting because people weren't. I mean, obviously there were some, but there wasn't to the degree they were expecting. Because
Yeah.
everyone was caught in it.
So given the lack of being able to communicate as like normal, coupled with having to drop a lot of your gear to run, so now you don't have all the equipment you normally would have. I mean, what even happened next? I mean, was it a matter of like you yourself had to figure out, okay, what should I do because you didn't necessarily have the direction of of one of your leaders, or what could
Well,
you do when you,
always,
was so normal?
there's always a chain of command, and that chain of command kind of got wiped out on the initial.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of confusion as to what to do at that point in time when we did go in, kind of thing, you know. And it's not like going in where you walk into a building. You're basically like, as things started to clear up a little bit, you're looking around, what you can see through breaks of cloud, dust, and smoke, whatever it was, you know, is, you know, destruction. Um, I've used and referenced like the movie Planet of the Apes before. It was like looking at a scene from Planet of the Apes, like an old city just destroyed, and that's all we could see around about us, you know. Um, I mean, I think the guys basically focused on trying to. We all just kind of looked at to help whatever we could do to pull people out, whatever. That wasn't much of that. It was a little bit, you know, pulled out some, help take some guys down from areas that were kind of just, I don't know how to describe it, just debris that was high up. So you
Yeah,
just, you know, it was just, it's kind of just crazy stuff all day.
absolutely. So I know that you obviously had already worked for 24 hours
Yeah,
before this happened.
yeah.
So how late were you there before going back to the Bronx?
We we were there till about 1 or 2 in the morning, and then we got relieved and we're told to go back to quarters. Now, I was supposed to be off during the day tour. So from 9 till 6, I was supposed to have some time off, but I worked all through that time. So when I got back to the firehouse at 2, 3 in the morning, I thought I was on duty. So I went up, had a quick shower, cleaned up, and went back down to work, just thinking that I was supposed to be manning the engine as one of the members for work. And it was a senior guy that said, "No, just go get some rest. We got it. Don't worry about it." So I said, "All right."
Well, speaking of the other guys who were there, I do have an excerpt from my book that I wanted to read for the listeners that describes when you got back to the firehouse. And 'cause I think people tend to assume that nowadays we have smartphones. We didn't have smartphones back then. Nowadays we have active social media. I mean, I think back then a predecessor to Facebook might have existed. I'm not sure if Friendster was a thing then or whatever, but so, even if social media did exist back then, it wasn't anywhere near as popular as it is now. So there was just a lack of communication on a lot of fronts.
Correct.
So lots of ambiguity. So what I wrote here about you going back to the station is this. Paul and his company worked until about 1 the next morning without food or water, breathing in contaminated air the entire time. They suffered from complete exhaustion as members of the Red Cross periodically wiped soot from their eyes. At 2 or 3 a.m., they made their way back to their firehouse. I told myself I wasn't going to cry. As the rig approached the station, they could see the other members of their firehouse waiting for them in the street. Not knowing if Paul and his company were dead or alive, the others greeted them by streetlight with hugs and tears. The surprising reunion was especially emotional given the fact that Paul's rig had initially been heading straight to the World Trade Center the day before. Had they not incurred the 20 or 25-minute delay before driving to the staging area in Harlem, they, along with the other engine companies that joined them, likely would have been in the first tower as it collapsed. So I can't even imagine, when you got back to your fire station, the fact that the other people who were there had no clue if
No,
any of you were still with us.
they had no idea at all. So it was,
No, yeah, and just to see them by the streetlight,
yeah,
waiting there for you, and do you remember just kind of the emotion and just kind of how that felt to be reunited?
yeah, I do remember going back and guys in the street waiting because they had no clue. And obviously, I think they had a lot of sense of relief. We didn't realize. Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess you think about it, we didn't really have access to phones. Although there was one point throughout the day, there was a payphone that was found still working, and I think there was a line of people trying to call loved ones and things like that. So, but yeah, we didn't have cell phones; they were all dead. If anyone had a phone on them, and not everyone had phones back then.
Right,
Um, yeah,
right.
but yeah, we had no way to communicate with the firehouse that we were still around and just working. I think that was with the case of everyone really. So yeah, it was emotional going back. And like I said, I was focused. I thought I had to go to work. So I was like,
Mm.
get cleaned up and get to work.
Right. So, so after you're in the firehouse and you sleep finally, did you then have an opportunity to go home, or did you get sent back to ground zero then
No,
to
no, 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 no.
keep working?
We rested up. I mean, at that point, I think, obviously the fire department in general was trying to figure out like what to do and how to get waves of members down for rescue and so on and so forth. And so I guess they started strategically sending companies down. We went down. So that was, I want to say we went down on the Wednesday, but maybe it was the Thursday, like a day later. We all basically kind of lived at that firehouse because you just didn't really leave much. And if you did leave, it was only for a couple hours and we'd come back.
Well,
Um,
and when you mention companies, that's actually firefighters, not like companies people think of like in the outside
correct.
world.
Yeah. So like
Okay.
in the firehouse that I worked out of in the South Bronx, 83 and Ladder 29, those were two fire companies in the same firehouse. Truck
Okay.
company, the ladders on top, and then the engine company with the hoses and the water in the rig kind of thing is how you would separate them.
So I remember you and I spoke earlier about just kind of the vernacular that's used and how I know I myself learned a lot when I met with you and talked about your
Yeah,
interview for the book, but the listeners might not be that familiar with this stuff. So
sure.
the person who drives the fire engine or the fire truck is called a chauffeur.
Correct.
So I think people who aren't used to that might think like chauffeur, they associate that with limousines, but yeah, that's
Sure.
different.
It's
Um,
positions that have job titles or job titles that have jobs to do. So chauffeur, you know, nozzle man, backup, control, doorman. These are positions in the engine. The truck companies have positions as well. There's obviously an officer, another chauffeur, and then you've got, outside man, OV, roof man, can man, irons man is a forcible injury team. There's positions. Yeah, we have.
okay. All right. And then a fire engine is different from a fire truck, correct? If I
And
remember
well,
correctly.
yeah, well, yes and no. um, a truck is a truck company, ladder company,
Okay.
longer vehicle, either a aerial ladder mounted to the back of the rig, or it could have a bucket mounted. Still a ladder company. Engine company is companies that have hose lines. Someone's got to put the fire out, and someone's got to make the rescues. Get to the floor.
Right. Right. Exactly. So it's my understanding that you would then take, was it city buses, I believe, to go back to ground
Yeah.
zero?
So I guess it was after a week or so, the organization basically said we're going to detail for, I think it was 2.5 weeks at time, members from all the firehouses around the boroughs, to groups, and you would meet where where we met, or where I was told to go was over in Queens. There was a over near like Shea Stadium in Queens. There was a section, the marina. You'd go there when you were supposed to work, and you'd meet up with guys that were in your group, guys from all over the city. You'd get gear for digging, gear for breathing, like rebreathers, and whatever, goggles and um, like jumpsuits, like these brown suits that you put onesie thing you put on, for digging, and they'd bus us down through the streets with.
Wow.
It was weird because you had like cops leading the way of a bunch of buses heading down to Lower Manhattan.
Wow.
People standing in the roads too with signs and waving, and that part was,
Really?
yeah, inspirational.
Wow.
Yep.
Absolutely. So, and if I remember correctly, on 9/11, but it might have been in the days that ensued, that people were called back to work. So anybody who was on vacation or thought they had the day off or whatever
Correct.
got called back in,
That's correct. Yeah. Total recall.
but and how long could people do the rescue? Is it called rescue before recovery? Where
Yeah.
the thought is that people can't go without water for at least 3 days, so it kind of
Right.
changes things after that.
Sure. Yeah, you can do without food for a lot longer, but obviously you need water. But yeah, I mean, I don't remember how many days they deemed it a recovery before they, changed the. the name of it, I guess.
Right. Well, and given the fact that over 300 firefighters passed away there, chances are it might be that you find someone that you knew. And I remember a story, I forget how far you were into it, where you participated in going to ground zero and digging through the debris and what have you. But I want to make sure I tee this up correctly. You were there, was it with a lieutenant or a captain? And someone had been found in the debris, and the two of you were given the opportunity to go pull the person from the debris, but he had been warned ahead of time that it was someone that he knew. Could you tell people about that?
Yeah. So I detailed down there many times, and it was probably, I think it was the very last time I went down. I was working in the firehouse on a Friday day tour, and we got in a call. They'd found a member from our house who was detailed out for. I mean, they had a pilot program, or a program the fire department had at the time, where um, junior guys or probies would go do experiences at different companies around the city. And one of the guys assigned to our house had been working in a company on South Street, Lower Manhattan, and it's, could be a year, could be 6 months. I forget what that detail length of time was, but he wasn't currently assigned to our firehouse, but he was working and was one of the missing. And I was working the day that they found him, and they asked the company to come down and take him out. His father was a battalion chief, and so he was obviously called down as well. And I remember we went down and we carried him out, Tommy Scholes, and his dad was there, and it was just sad.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's hard enough carrying a stranger out of the debris, but to have it be your son, I can't even fathom that. It's just, and the fact that that the son wanted to be a firefighter, and obviously the dad was a firefighter. I
Yeah,
mean, that's a really big deal.
yeah.
Wow.
His son was a police officer and transferred to the fire department. Tommy
Wow.
was a cop first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I remember when I had interviewed you for the book that we talked about how, I mean, obviously September 11th is in September, but fast forwarding to a few months to December. So
Mm-hmm.
it was actually Christmas. You had shared about how, you're in your gear down by ground zero, and it was about 4 in the morning, I believe, when you just kind of thought, you know what, I need to get away from this and kind of like just kind of have a mental health break and go for a walk.
Yeah.
And I remember you shared how you went to this little church that people now call the little church that stood, if I'm not mistaken,
Correct. It
because
didn't.
it was so close to ground zero but didn't collapse.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the name of the church? Is it Trinity, I think?
It could be. I don't remember the name of the church. It's been
Yeah.
some years, but it's a small little church. It's surrounded by some gravestones that are very, very, very old.
Hmm.
Some deteriorated and collapsed. And I remember, wandering off. I mean, you have to remember, this is months and months after the fact. So a lot of what was, a pile has now become a pit. We're inside the walls of. They built the towers like in like what they would call a bathtub. They had these
Okay.
reinforced outside walls to keep water from coming in from the island, and it had been dug down. Now at that point we called it a pit, not the pile, which was our old name for it. And yeah, just took a mental health, stroll. Ended up on Christmas morning in a church. It was kind of surreal and weird at the same time.
So I'm envisioning you, like for you to be in your gear, would it be like, I'm picturing pants with suspenders, or how would you describe like what you were wearing?
So I think I probably had my regular bunker gear on because I'd been working in the firehouse the night before. So I wasn't detailed to uh, a recovery team at the time. I was working, and I stepped up to work for a member who was going to go home to his family, a senior guy. And I said, listen, I'll jump on the rig and you can take my position in the engine and I'll go down and, whatever. And so I had my regular bunker gear on, I'm sure of it, and my helmet and whatever. So just kind of wandered into church. It was Christmas morning.
So here you are, it's pitch black outside.
Yeah, it's early.
Yeah, it's like 4 in the morning or something.
Mhm.
You're in the church. I'm picturing you, with your fireman's hat and your bunker gear. And if I remember correctly, there were very few people in the church at that time,
Yes,
just maybe like 3 or 4 people.
middle of the night. So
Yes. And it's Christmas. And I mean, do you recall just the emotion that you felt when you s- when you began to kneel or when you sat there in the church?
it was emotional, but and it's funny how I ended up in church, but
Hmm.
wasn't many people around. It was just a moment I shared for myself.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was Christmas.
Yeah, and it was
So,
probably by that time maybe five in the morning, 6 in the morning, because I think we went down there at 2 or 3, and we did digging a little bit, and there's not much to do. They just send companies down to do last walkarounds and things of that nature. And yeah, we I went over to the church.
wow.
It was
Yeah,
close.
that's definitely a moment that, will stay in your mind and in your heart forever. So, how many months were you a part of the what was it, the pile then the pit, or whatever the names were? Like, how many months was that?
So after September 11th, it was a few months of um, recovery, I guess, by that time, and digging on off 2.5 weeks here or whatever, and then kind of was back to the firehouse full time by then. That was around Christmas time, and the last time I went down was that Friday. That I want to say it was January or February, where we went down to take Tommy out, and that was the last time I'd gone down for
Okay.
work purposes. So
So I remember as part of your book interview talking about how because so many first responders had passed away, that there were funerals. And sometimes you had to decide, well, which one do I go to? Because maybe one was in New Jersey at the same time that one was on Long Island, and
correct.
it was just so. Do you recall? I mean, how many months or years, was it, and how frequent was it that you were having to go to these services?
They went on for, I believe, just over a year.
Oh,
I think the last one to the day was Peter Beanfield or Beinfield. I can't say his name correctly. I'm sorry,
okay, okay,
but I
that's all
think
right.
his was like a year to the date after the events of 2000. I guess yeah, it was about a year. So what they would do is they would list all the funerals or memorials. A lot of times it was just a memorial service because there wasn't a body, and they would have um, groups of areas, like some on Long Island, some on upstate, some out in Brooklyn, some out in Queens, whatever. And you hit a list, wherever ones you could get to in a day, 2 or 3 or 4 a day if you could. And it was every
Two,
day.
three, or 2, 3, or 4 services in a given day.
Yeah, you'd make an
Wow.
appearance, and if you weren't working, you go to a funeral or a wake or a memorial service. Because you also had wakes, you had funerals, you had memorial.
Mhm.
A lot of times you had memorials, and then if they found a body or a piece of a body, they'd have a funeral then.
I remember you sharing before that sometimes you would go to a service twice for someone because maybe it was initially a service where the body hadn't been found yet, and then
Correct.
after the remains were found, then there would be a service later. And again, I can't even fathom the emotion and the psychology with that because you're trying to build closure after the first service, and then to go to another one is just. Did you kind of feel like you were walking around kind of in a fog, or how would you describe that?
Well, it went on for months and months and months. So it just kind of
Yeah.
became second nature. I mean, part of the whole fire department tradition is that you never miss a funeral ever. And it made it difficult because there was so many going on in a given day on so far apart, upstate New York compared to out in Long Island, for instance, there's
Right.
no way, there's hours and hours of driving between the two locations. You'd never be able to hit them. So
I'm picturing them with the bagpipes that I would see on TV. Was that given the fact that there were so many services,
mhm.
did those I guess what would you call the organizations that had the bagpipe players?
The fire department pipes and drums band would have sent a representative from the band. There's quite a lot of members in the band. And, on funeral days that were traditionally just a single fireman, the whole band would show up to play drums and bagpipes and the whole nine. And obviously they would have to break that up. And I mean, they went through a lot too, just being able to try to show representation for all the services going on. So you'd get at least, one or two bagpipers or something would show up, help
Wow.
with everything.
Just the sounds of those bagpipes, they're so hauntingly beautiful.
Yeah.
It's kind of a surreal thing,
Yeah.
but um so given your history, your personal history with Scotland, would you mind sharing with the listeners just what time you spent there and how old you were
Yeah.
and how that kind of played into who you are?
Sure. So, I was born here in New York. I was born in New York. But first years of my life, I spent with my grandparents. My mom worked, single parent family. She worked here in America, and I was in Scotland for the first 2 years. We went back to Scotland when I was 5 and a half to live, and it didn't really work out. So 6, 8 months, we came back to the United States, and then she went back again to Scotland with me until I was from 10 years old till 16 straight. I went to high school there. So I have a lot of friends and family still in Scotland.
Wow. So all that being said, and given the theme of the podcast as far as emotional grit and kind of just how people get through things, would you say that for you, having to go from one country to another, different cultures, different traditions, maybe different styles and different ways of doing things, do you
Sure.
think part of that has kind of, for you, kind of the whole idea of nature and nurture, especially coming from a single parent household,
Right.
that kind of helped build a foundation for you to draw from later in life in terms of trying to get through things?
I think I was very lucky to have two different cultures, two different, living experiences.
I agree.
More than a lot of people. And I think, I don't know if it prepared me for, what you'd mentioned, but I can tell you that I have experiences from both living here in the United States and living in Scotland, and they're both very positive.
Cool.
And
Very cool.
I look at myself very lucky in that regard.
Oh yeah. No, I can relate to that as far as the being in a single parent household because yeah, I saw firsthand a lot of emotional grit, that took place and trying to
Mhm.
figure out the how as well,
Yeah.
but so I wanted to also share another part of the what I had written about you as it relates to 9/11. This is how I had closed out the chapter
Hmm.
and just explaining about, what you had done and obviously the what happened on 9/11. And just how for you to be a firefighter, I mean, I have an immense amount of respect for things that you've done. So I ended it with this selfless mindset can be attributed to other first responders as well. When Paul first wanted to become a firefighter in 1992, he couldn't do so for 7 years because there was a wait list of people wanting to serve, people who were willing to put the lives of others ahead of their own, people who persevered just like Paul and exemplified the power and strength of emotional grit. So, with that, I know that you're incredibly humble, and I know that I have talked to you off camera, just about the whole idea of what I think about what you did and what other firefighters did, and of course the police officers and just the ambulance people and all that kind of stuff, and everything people endured, and that whole idea of and that whole mindset of being willing to put the lives of others ahead of your own. Is that something that you would say can be taught, or is it kind of like people are born with it, and then by having those jobs, it just kind of I guess just kind of like brings it to a head and kind of nurtures it?
I guess a good question. I think everyone's individual, and people are built a certain way, right? Just
Yeah.
certain things that you do in life. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, just for me, I've always wanted to help people. So, the waiting list was because of scores, things like that. So you take a test, and I had a really high score in the test for the fire department, a 99 and a half out of 100. And I passed the physical and I passed the psychological. Um, but when you lived in New York City boroughs, you would get a 5 point kick, or if you had military time, you get a 5 point kick, and if you had this and that. And so I was further down the list based on other parameters. Um, and I think I was list number 2272. So it took 7 years to get to my list number. That's why it
Wow.
was a wait, and it was worth the wait because it's the best job in the world.
Wow. Man. Oh, you're gonna make me cry again. So, um, As we close things out, is there anything that you wanted to call out for the listeners, whether it be a story that happened, something that you saw, or something you learned, or a takeaway? Anything come to mind?
There's just so many stories, and you hear about them after the fact, and there's you know, somebody worked for someone else and they survived, the other one didn't. Things like that. They're the ones I remember about. They're the ones I think about. I miss the friends I lost too.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, and anybody who you're still in touch with, please extend a thank you. Not just on my behalf, but on behalf of other people as well. It's just I think what you did is incredibly amazing, and I don't know, I'm speechless, and that takes a lot. So, all right, well, we'll go ahead and close things out then. So thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your story. And it just makes things real, and people can look back and think about the things that you shared, and realize that, hey, you know what? Yeah, this happened, and we should show some respect and learn from it.
I appreciate
So, and to those of you who are listening today, thank you so much for joining us. To actually see more episodes, please go to YouTube, to my YouTube channel called Emotional Grit. And thanks for being with us today.